Hey everybody, it's Rothbard's Disciple here. I'm bringing you guys a short video today. This was actually supposed to be a part of my original video on Craig Wright, only because this video focuses on something that Emin Gunsarer and Peter Reisen says you're a part of a cult if you believe this is possible. And they're referring to when Craig Wright said you could do Bitcoin transactions in 10 milliseconds. Now, I don't specifically know what he meant by that, what Craig was talking about. However, it does seem to me that there's a couple very easy ways. Some people will call this sort of cheating, but there's a couple easy ways to accept transactions before all nodes have seen them. Okay, you don't need to check all the nodes, necessarily. You know what I mean? And we're going to go ahead and talk about why here. The first thing you guys got to understand is that you have to, when you're viewing a double spend, you have to think like you're the attacker. Okay, so the whole thing with double spends, the whole issue with trying to accept transactions that like before waiting at least 1 second is that somebody could try and double spend on the other side of the world at the same time, and if they do it and both their transactions are within a couple milliseconds, it's hard to tell which one's going to win. Obviously, it's the first one that gets propagated. But if let's say I had a friend in China and we wanted to, do some sort of double spend attack on some sort of digital goods supplier or whatever, we might both, set our clocks, like get some super accurate clocks, and then send transactions at certain specific times. That way, if the company accepted the transaction with a few milliseconds, then, we could reverse it with our double spend. Well, the thing you got to remember about these sort of double spends where you plan out exactly when this transaction is going to happen is that you have to know, like you have to be as the purchaser in charge of when that transaction occurs. Okay, so the thing you got to remember is that in almost all circumstances, the purchaser does not have control over when their transaction occurs. One way to think about this is like, let's say you go to Walmart, right, and you're standing in line at Walmart, or you just walk into Walmart. I don't care what your plan is. Like, if you try and tell me that you can get your transaction to complete within a couple of milliseconds of when you predict it to complete, you're a liar. I'm sorry, that's never going to happen. Okay, so in these circumstances where you know that the purchaser has an almost 0% chance of ever being able to predict when their double spend is going to occur, you actually do not need to check all the nodes in the world. And the reason why is very simple, because if your purchaser cannot predict when their purchase is going to happen, then that means they can also not predict when they need to send out that double spend. So their double spend will never work. It's never going to happen, okay? And so all you have to actually do in this sort of situation, like let's look at this, this picture of this complete graph here, and let's assume that you're just at that node on the top of this complete graph, all right? And let's say you're going to a store, and this store has some sort of business with N-Chain and Calvinaire and Craig Wright. I don't know exactly which company is their mining operation, but whichever part of their company does the mining operation, you could have some sort, like let's say Walmart just has some sort of contract with N-Chain, Calvinaire and Craig Wright, and they're just like, look, we want to accept transactions as fast as possible. We don't want to have to wait a full second for these transactions because we have millions of people coming through our stores every day. So an extra second for millions of people, that's a lot of wasted time and that's a lot of wasted profit. And so they're like, look, we've done the math. We know that the people who come into our store, they can't, there's no way that they can really try to double spend us. I mean, they could, but most of the time they're going to fail, and that's a risk that we're willing to take. So we actually want to get our transactions done in, like, let's say 50 milliseconds. Okay, I know Craig Wright said 10 milliseconds, but I'm just going to say 50 milliseconds. So 50 millisecond transaction time is much better than a 1 second transaction time. Okay, that's a lot of saved time for Walmart. And so all that N-Chain has to do is when somebody goes to purchase something from Walmart, they would have all these nodes set up all the way around the world, okay? And so these nodes would all be contacting that Walmart for all the transactions that Walmart had received, okay? So when Walmart receives a transaction, again, we're assuming Walmart's that node on the top. Maybe Walmart, since they're only waiting 50 milliseconds, they're only waiting for those first two nodes to the left and the right to contact Walmart, right? Because obviously the nodes, when they're sending the signals of which transactions they've received, the signals they're sent very fast, but they're not sent instantaneously, okay? So within 50 milliseconds, you know, the only nodes you can talk to are the two nodes to the left and the two nodes to the right. And again, the whole reason why Walmart is okay with this is because they're like, look, the chances of somebody being able to double spend us by predicting when their transaction is going to occur, it's very small. So again, the only real way for an attacker to have a high percentage of pulling off a double spend attack is if they try and propagate their double spend transaction from the same geographical location on Earth as their you know, the fake transaction. So both the double spend transaction and the one that has to get reversed have to be done in the same geographic location. Okay, and now somebody's going to sit here and say, well, what happens if there's some super elaborate thing where these guys actually do try to do some sort of double spend attack? Well, the first thing you got to remember is that if we assume it takes 1 second for electrical signals to travel around the world, then it only takes half a second for electrical signals to travel halfway around the world, right? And since when you send a transaction or when your transaction propagates on the network, it goes in all directions, by the time it's gone halfway around the world in all directions, it's actually gone all the way around the world, right? So you're only waiting, it's only 500 milliseconds to get from one side of the world to the other side of the world, right? So that's how close, I guess, the attacker has to be. Now, in order for this attacker to actually have their transaction broadcast first, but not get caught by those nodes within the 50 millisecond time, you know, that means that they have to be within 450 milliseconds on when their transaction is going to occur, okay? And I actually think that the transactions propagate slightly faster than 1 second. I think you can get it closer to half a second. So I'm actually giving a window for the attacker to be a lot bigger here. But let's imagine this attacker succeeds, and let's imagine they do the impossible, okay? Because the chances of them even getting within half a second on when their transaction occurs is basically zero. Because in the end, I don't know if you guys pay attention to this, but when you go to a store and you pay, the cashier has to press accept, okay? So it doesn't matter when you put your card in, it doesn't matter how you pay, the cashier is the one who chooses when to accept. And so being able to predict that's not that easy. But anyways, even if somebody does predict it, okay, even if somebody does predict it, like let's say you're at Walmart and your transaction gets accepted, even though you did successfully do a double spend, but because Walmart, again, they're only checking the nodes that they can contact within 50 milliseconds, they haven't contacted all the nodes yet. But the thing is Walmart is still connected to all those other nodes. So even though they didn't see the double spend transaction immediately, within that next 450 milliseconds, they absolutely have to, okay? The other thing you got to remember, too, is actually there's less time than 450 milliseconds after that transaction occurs to when the double spend transaction will go to Walmart, because again, the double spend transaction has to propagate before the transaction at Walmart in order to reverse the transaction at Walmart. So it's always going to be less than 450 milliseconds. But let's just assume it's the 450 milliseconds, okay? But you got like those 450 milliseconds of time, right, where you think you have a legitimate transaction. Well, do you think if you're at Walmart and you pay somebody, within 450 milliseconds, you can take all your goods from those little bags that they have, because you know they put your goods in the bags on that little twirly thing for you to pull off. Do you think you can pull off all your goods, put them in your cart, and get out of the store before anybody can stop you in 450 milliseconds? Like, is this a joke? This is the one thing that I really like that Craig Wright talks about. You know, I am an anarchist. I consider myself a national anarchist, which is a type of anarchy most people don't even understand. They think it doesn't make any sense. But all I mean by that is, like, I believe in voluntary associations of people for, like, governance and to form nations, just to have, you know, a certain way of life. But the one thing that I love about what Craig Wright talks about is he's like, you know, Bitcoin is not law. You know, you can't stop fraud and things with Bitcoin. So even in these situations, like with Walmart, you know, I don't know if Peter Risen and Emin Gun Sarer think that Walmart's going to just let people walk away if they've double spent the transaction when they know they've double spent the transaction, okay? Nobody can get out of that store in 450 milliseconds and grab all their shit, you know? Even if you just tried to sprint away afterwards, like the best thing, like that's the only way you can leave the store and not get caught and not get thrown in prison, is if you just, right as the transaction happens, you just sprint away. And if you just sprint away, you might be able to grab like one bag. And, you know, it's pretty obvious that you stole from them and they have cameras in their store. And so, you know, you're going to prison anyways. So the question is, you know, is it worth it? at any point in time, and I don't think that it is. And if you look at this situation like this, because it's on a blockchain, and a blockchain, like once something goes to a blockchain, it never reverses. If you do a double spend on a blockchain, you can't hide that. Okay, anyone who's connected to nodes that know that that's happened, like they'll be like, hey, this double spend transaction, it's it's not a legitimate transaction. So then all Walmart has to do in this situation is be like, look, we're not gonna give you shit. We're not gonna honor your transaction no matter what, because you can't accidentally double spend a transaction. The only way you could possibly accidentally have a double spend is if somebody has access to your private key. But then why would they be trying to double spend to help you not not have to pay money when you go to Walmart? You know what I mean? So if you're double spending, somebody's going to jail, and it's almost always going to be the person who's doing the double spending. You know what I mean? There's no such thing as an accidental double spend. It's not like, oh, hey, once we get Bitcoin used as money, we're just not going to go after people who try to commit financial fraud. You know what I mean? They're going to go after these people, and it makes no sense. And then the other thing that you guys can actually do is, because like I said, the one caveat to this example that I'm talking about is that you absolutely, and I mean this, you absolutely cannot use this sort of a setup so long as the customer has control over when their transaction will occur, or if that customer is not, actually at a brick and mortar store. Because like if you're doing a digital goods store and somebody double spends you, how do you get them? If they're real smart with covering their tracks on the internet, they could be completely anonymous and you wouldn't really know. So for things like digital goods stores, they won't be able to do double spend or they won't be able to accept zero confirmation transactions as quickly. And one thing that you might think that is the negative of this is that you might think of places like exchanges. You know what I mean? And I don't mean like cryptocurrency exchanges or Bitcoin exchanges. I mean like trading exchanges with stocks and equity and bonds and things like that. So if you have this big massive bank, let's just call Goldman Sachs, and Goldman Sachs does a lot of trading, right? And for traders, you need to be absolutely as fast as you possibly can. So if they're doing Bitcoin transactions, and let's say Goldman Sachs wants to actually be able to settle these transactions just as fast as possible, because again, if you're actually talking about somebody like Goldman Sachs and their trading exchange will be down to the nanoseconds, because they're not actually moving money at that point. But if they actually want to move money within a couple milliseconds, they can actually do this, okay? And they can actually do this, and they can do this in a way that all of their customers can trust that money being in their account that quickly, okay? And the way that they do this is they would contact Calvin Ayre, Craig Wright of N-Chain and their mining operation. I don't know the name of their mining operation. I don't know if it's under CoinGeek or whatever, but they contact Calvin Ayre and Craig Wright, and they're like, look, we want to be able to settle all our transactions to our customers as fast as possible, because a lot of them are high-frequency traders. Maybe they got accounts at different accounts that they have to move money to within our own exchange, or maybe that's within other companies, whatever. Goldman Sachs just wants to offer them the fastest money experience possible, and they want their customers to be able to trust Goldman Sachs, because again, in this scenario, the question is, will Goldman Sachs double spend on their own customers? Now, all that they have to do for this scenario is they got to contact Craig Wright and Calvin Ayre, and they got to be like, look, we're going to give you the names of our wallets that we're going to use for these services, and then we're going to associate these wallets with ourselves. Like, we'll give you all our contact information, all this stuff. And so then they say, look, if any sort of double spend ever occurs in one of these accounts, then you just come after us with the full force of the law. And so then the way that somebody like that actually gets around doing fast transactions is just through normal regulation, boys. You know what I mean? It's just like they just say, hey, this is my account number, and so if you want to accept this transaction from this account, you can accept it super fast, because you know that this account is associated with me and me only, and anything that goes wrong with that account or the Bitcoins in that address comes back onto me. You know what I mean? So there's two ways. There's two ways that you can get way faster transactions than having to wait for 100% of your nodes to validate your transaction. Okay. The first way is just simply, you don't need to check all of the transaction, or you don't need to check all the nodes on the network if the attacker cannot, if they can't predict where the attack's going to go. And I know this is sort of cheating, because again, if they do a double spend, you do actually have to wait for the full 500 milliseconds for the transaction, or for the for the signals to go all the way around the world. But again, most people aren't ever going to try a double spend, because they know even if they try a double spend, they're never going to get away with it. So why do you have to wait the full time for the all 100% of the nodes to see transactions if nobody can get away with the double spend? You don't. All you need is some sort of policing activity, some sort of regulation outside of Bitcoin. And this is the, it's just the part that boggles my mind when people think like, yo, Bitcoin does everything. You can just write up a code into a Bitcoin smart contract, and you'll make a business, and it'll be the best business in the world. It's like, no, Bitcoin's just money. It's a very interesting type of money, but it's just money. It requires people to implement it, you know what I mean? And so if you're actually talking about things like double spends and things like that, like if somebody double spends at Walmart, again, even if they are successful in the double spend, they're not getting anywhere because Walmart knows about that double spend within a couple milliseconds. So, that's why Walmart doesn't have to wait the full time, because Walmart might say, well, we know that nobody's ever going to get away with this double spend, so the chances of anybody ever actually trying it are very small. If they do try it, we'll catch them. We will lose money because we'll have to, they'll lose money if they catch a double spender, only because they have to spend labor of their employees trying to catch that double spender, and then they got to get the police involved. But if they do the math, and Walmart has a lot of statistics on their customer base and the amounts of fraud that get committed on them. But if they do the math and they figure out, hey, it actually makes us more money to shave off half a second on our transaction speed time than it does to wait for 100% of nodes to validate the transaction, then they'll do that. You know what I mean? So it's all down to a business decision. But I hope this helped explain to you why, it gets real stupid when people say things like, "Oh, you're in a cult if you disagree with them." Peter Risen and Emmett Sorare need to start talking like scientists again. Because this, again, they'll probably say, "Hey, this method that I'm talking about is cheating because it requires outside regulation." And it's like, well, of course it fucking does. Like, that's the whole way that this thing works. Like, if you're Walmart and you let somebody walk away when they've double spent you, you're an idiot. That's all I have to say. Like, you deserve to go out of business. It's not that hard to stop somebody trying to double spend at any sort of brick and mortar store. The only time it's hard to stop a double spender is in a scenario where your only connection to this entity is digitally. You know what I mean? And even then, all you have to do is have that entity put up their name and who they are, and then stake all their reputation on the fact that they won't double spend. And then if they do double spend, you've got all their information and they're going to jail. But anyways, I hope this explained that to you. There'll be more videos coming.